Thank you. Hello and welcome, everyone. Before we get started, I'd just like to continue in the effort of paying homage to the late icon John Lewis, in which we were honorably privileged to have him in our presence here in Elberton back in 2003 as the speaker for our NAACP banquet. We were able to, some of us were able to take a picture with him, and which is located in the book that Arlen wrote on page 84. If those of you who don't have the book would like to purchase it, just a little tidbit there. But in getting back to our my presentation for the afternoon, just like to say that Dr. Jelani has kind of made it a little easier for me because he's already set the stage with, his discussion on implicit and explicit biases, racism-wise. So I'm going to share with you some of my experiences of coming along during the Jim Crow era, and back when people of color were known as colored folks and eventually became Negroes in the 50s. So in discussing that, I'd like to kind of set the stage of the era, the time, and that's why you have the first slide here is a picture of the house I was born in and lived, I guess, the first 18 years of my life and until I went away to college. And the reason why I wanted to share that house with you is because back in those days, this was probably the early 30s when this house was moved from a site on the Athens Highway to the site of 268 Lockland Street by my father. And I don't know how he purchased the lumber and all that to build it, but he moved it from there. It was there, and then he moved it to this site and rebuilt it. So that's just a little tidbit on how the house and that I was born and lived in for 18 years got there. And by the way, this area in which he purchased the property was nothing but trees and bushes and so forth until he purchased that property. So that's a little tidbit on that. And the next slide, which is letting you know what the cars look like during my beginning era. That's a 1939 Chevrolet in which my father owned, and it's parked in front of the house that my mother was grew up in, and that's one of her cousins in the picture. And the next slide is, that's the picture on the well, actually the title picture on the book that Arlen wrote. And that shows me as a baby with my dad and my mom, showing you the era in which, or how they dressed during that era. And the next slide, this takes us to the era in which there was rampant migration from the South to the North by people of color in order to find a better life. So this is my father with his zoot suit and hat, and my mother and my mother's brother, one of my mother's brothers, uh, and me as a child. So my parents decided that they wanted to leave Elberton for a better life and go north. So they migrated from Elberton to Jersey City, New Jersey. And this, I believe, was back in the 40s. Her family, its sisters and brothers, except for one of her sisters and one of her brothers, had migrated to Jersey City. And this was my experience of living in the housing projects in Jersey City, in which my uncle there, pictured with them, was the custodian. And it always was important to know somebody to get to where you wanted to get. So that's kind of a setting of the stage of my venturing on the journey through the Jim Crow era. Now, what's interesting about sharing this story with you is a couple of questions popped up, and they were, when did you first realize that you were not considered equal? And at what age did you begin to interact with white people? So the interacting with white people really started at an early age for me, because for some reason when my parents shopped, they would take me along, and you know, the interacting with the people, naturally the business owners were all white. So that was that kind of interacting. But the one thing I never had the privilege of while living in Edmonton was to be able to interact or play with, as we called it, with children who were white. So, you know, the interacting really started at an early age, but to consider myself unequal didn't really begin. And I might say interacting when we moved to Jersey City back in the 40s with, you know, persons who lived in the projects, helped me to kind of understand the whole idea of interacting, because there were whites and maybe a few Spanish-speaking persons living there. For some reason, my parents, Jersey City, New Jersey did not set that well with them. So they decided after 2 years there that they wanted to return to Elberton. I don't really know. My mom would say, you know, would tease me really and say, you wanted to go back home. And we just decided that since you wanted to go back home so badly, we moved back. But I think it was that they did not like Jersey City, New Jersey, like her brothers and sisters did. And, you know, upon returning to Elberton, and, you know, I experienced a lot of incidents that were mentioned by Dr. Jelani, you know, such as racial profiling, not being accepted well enough to enter the front door of businesses or the drugstores. We always had to go through the side door or the back door. Even when we wanted ice cream, to purchase ice cream at the Dairy Queen, we had to go to the side door. And we were prepared pretty much by our parents to deal with that. So it became a part of our living. Another incident that was told to me by my parents, in which my one of my uncles, who was the last one to leave Elberton to go to Jersey City, was involved in a fight in which there were blacks, well, in those days, coloreds, and whites were involved. And one of the white boys was cut with a knife. And my uncle was arrested and jailed. And because the only black doctor in Elberton at that time, Dr. R.C. Jones, was known by the Caucasian population here, he was able to convince them to release my uncle, and without incident, but a trial was scheduled. So immediately upon release of my uncle, my dad and mom placed my uncle on the train, Silver Coming known back in those days, to Jersey City. And he escaped, being what could have been a lynching, because they did look for him, but he was gone. So that was an incident that kind of stayed with me for a long time. And by the way, my uncle never came back to, well, he never really not come back to Elberton for 20 years. So, these are some of the incidents as I journeyed through my venture during the Jim Crow era. Upon returning to Elberton, this is a picture of Dad, Mom, and me. I think we came back when I was about 5. We stayed in Jersey City about 2 or 3 years. And this was, I believe I'm just getting ready to go to school, or may have been enrolled in school at the time. But I might add, I was a pretty shy person, and kind of stayed with Dad and Mom all the time. And I was kind of sheltered, and only went in the section in Elberton where whites were located when I was with them. So I think is there another picture with me on the school? Oh, yes. Naturally, during this era, it was separate. The black school was on one side of the town, so to speak, and the white school was on the other side. And it was during the hand-me-down era, in which books were handed down to us from the white school when they wanted to purchase newer books. And naturally, it was all blacks because we lived on the black side of the city, and they lived on the white side of the city. So you had your usual children interacting with each other, only they were on black, only all black, that was the bullying, that was all of this that goes along with being enrolled as a youngster. And I experienced all that. And in being an only child, it was not that easy for me, because many times I had to run away from a lot of this because I had no one to actually protect me. So that was I think this was first grade, and this was a later age in which a picture was taken of. I don't know why it was all boys in this picture, but here I am in the center with some of my classmates. And now I'm going to hold this picture for a little bit and then just kind of tell you about some of the incidents, maybe one or two incidents in getting a job during my high school years. Um, just coming back a little bit, reverting back a little bit before high school, I remember my first job was cutting grass for a white family um, in Elberton, in which I had to be prepared by my parents of, first of all, when you go to the house, you don't go to the front door, you go to the back door to let them know you were there. And then when you finish, you know, you have to be manable and say, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. And all of this went along with that era. And one of the things I want to point out that, especially to our young audience, is that during this time, the little money, well, salary, if you can call it a salary, that was paid to me as a grass cutter. Each time I did a cutting of grass, a portion of that money went to my mother. And until I was much older, I didn't know that my mom saved all that money for me. So that's just a little tidbit to young people who, that's how much I felt about my mom being included in what I had done and how she and my dad had prepared me for the first job. Now, the next job I had to be prepared because it was working in a hospital. And as you may hear, explicit and implicit bias is inculcated in just about all of the activities that I participated. And even though I'm not mentioning it, you can kind of see that it is implicit and a bit explicit as I went along during this Jim Crow era. Now back to the job that I was about to mention as a employee in the hospital. Setting a stage for that, I had to be prepared by the gentleman who was leaving the job, who naturally was colored during that time. He met with my family. He and his family met with my family. They prepared me in becoming manable and how to become manable, saying yes, sir, no, sir, entering in the hospital through the back door and not the front door, which was reserved for whites only, and dressing in the basement, in the restroom, in connection with where the patients were housed, which was on the ground floor, basement, as I indicated, and patients there only on the bottom floor and not allowed to be patients on the first floor. And even when there was an overage of patients, the patients were placed in the hallway, in beds in the hallway, rather than in a room that was above the ground floor. So these are things that I experienced during that era. Um, in high school, going back from while I was in high school, um, we were involved in a job program, and I think it was called DCT. Don't remember what DCT stood for back in those days, in which we were allowed to uh, leave or be released from school early and report to our, um, designated jobs. And I might add that back in those days, um, jobs were menial. I mean, there were jobs such as car repair assistants, cook assistants, no head cooks, bellhops, um, no colored receptionists, no colored clerks. Even the job that I had working in the hospital, I was a dishwasher. Um, the facility was set up such as many of us can recall. There's a white section where the whites ate, and there was a colored section where the coloreds ate. Um, and I guess during this time, uh, when I worked there, naturally, the white patients were served first, and then the colored patients were served second when it came to meals. So that's kind of a picture of what happened to me during that Jim Crow era. Um, some of the experiences, I'll just share a few of them that I encountered. Was, I remember going to shop with my mother and window shopping for a while, being hit in the back or kicked in the back and called the N-word. And a lot of these incidents that happened to me didn't happen to me that many times. I was racial profiles. I experienced all of that during this time. Um, the one incident that has stuck with me, I guess more than others, was when I guess I was still in high school, um, or just entering high school, was when the KKK group paraded in our neighborhood. They did it in cars. What they did was they paraded down one street and up another street past our house, um, and they never um, got out of their cars, but they came through blowing their horns with their hoods on, make sure that, and I assume as I look back that this was an effort to remind us of our place and to remind us that we have to stay in our place, and that if we did not do that, that the KKKs would take action. So during that parade, my dad and mom were on porch. They didn't move. I was inside because I didn't like outside because of the mosquitoes, and I remained inside and until it passed by. It lasted about 10, 15 minutes. But that has stayed with me uh, um, most of my life uh, as I remember back. Now, as I was talking about um, I have to go to my props here. So bear with me. As I was talking about realizing not being considered equal. And mind you, I guess the transgression of incidents, I guess, not only happened to me as being something that was hurtful and painfully deep, but a lot of my classmates, playmates, uh, and so forth who experienced this kind of had the same kind of inner feelings. But but in considering being unequal, I guess that really happened to me. I guess around the age of 9 or so, when I noticed, when we traveled from to and from Jersey City in that migration era, that was this separate section for coloreds and as opposed to whites. And it dawned on me, why was it that they were there and we were where we were and we were not together? And for some reason, that to me meant that since what they were going through on the white side was much more elaborate than what we experienced on the colored side, kind of made me feel that I was not equal. So that was really the beginning of my feeling of feeling not equal or unequal to whites. And I never discussed this with my parents because they had always reminded me uh, time in and time out of my place and how it was. So kind of became natural, if you can look at it from that standpoint. But that's kind of how I um, envisioned being in that era. But other things that happened, like entertainment, for instance, we had colored only um, grocery stores, which somehow left us. We had our own undertakers, which we still have now. Uh, but the jobs at that time was, as I indicated before, menial, and there were no high-level jobs for colored people at the time. Uh, One of the incidents, well, not an incident, one of the things that I remember at one of the um, ballrooms that was owned by a colored person at that time. His name was Leroy Dooley. And this is where a lot of entertainment went on, in which there were parties, there were dances, there were, and by the way, this is the first time and only time that I met James Brown, who would visit Elberton on occasions. And I had the privilege of being able to meet him, hear him sing, I think one of his first songs that he placed on his first album. And at the time, I was a so-called up-and-coming trombonist in a small band that was put together by one of my schoolmates at the time. And we were there kind of playing along with James Brown just a little bit. So that was an exciting experience. But other than, our own grocery stores, our own um, undertakers, and, we had Elks Club and so forth. That was kind of the entertainment that we experienced during those days. So it may sound a bit painful to you, but if you lived it, it was kind of an acceptance bias because that was our place, and that is how we operated, and that was our means of survival. I mean, just like slavery, they had a means of survival during the Jim Crow era. We had a means of survival. Now, upon graduating from high school, college was another era for me because other than that experience going to Jersey City, I had not left Elberton for anything. So I don't know whether it was kind of a cultural shock for me to go away to college, but luckily I went to an all-black college, graduated from all-black college, Albany, Georgia, Albany State College at the time, and I still was limited in mingling with Caucasians, white people, even during and through my undergrad years. But upon leaving college, I was able to acquire a job in Bedford Hills, New York. And of course, it was a camp for young people, youth. And it was mainly blacks. But I noticed that the camp, well, it was run by black and whites. So this was kind of the beginning of my real intermingling with white persons. So I did not stay on that job too long, and was luckily not knowing, but having relatives who knew some people in New York City. And I was able to get a job, a provisional job with the city of New York. And here I worked for a little while, and it was the first time that I had the experience of mingling with other nationalities. And I befriended a Latino. Actually, he was from Puerto Rico. And he was the person who kind of gave me the insight on how Latinos were discriminated against and how he was discriminated against, even though he had a college degree. And so this was, I guess, a continuing effort on the discrimination effort that I experienced. I credit him for a lot of what happened to me job-wise while living in New York, because he actually recommended me to be a Head Start teacher director. Knew nothing about teaching, knew nothing about administration, but upon his recommendation, I got the job in West Harlem. And this was mainly with black children. I don't think we had any white children or any white staff. Oh no, one white staff, a counselor at the time. And that job led me to um, a, um, a graduate um, uh, being admitted into graduate school, uh, which was mainly centered around early childhood education and counseling. So this was my real introduction after uh, doing 2 years of work as a teacher and as an administrative person, and with a lot of help from the teachers who were mainly savvy in early childhood education. So, and it was not, I didn't experience that much, at least I didn't feel that it was that much racism as part of my experience as a graduate student during those years. Um, in fact, those of us who were of color were privileged to be able to visit another country. We were able to go to London because the grant that was administered to the college for the purpose. Now, this grant was for the purpose of educating about 6 students a year during a fellowship, which the majority of the students happened to be Negroes. We were Negroes then. And so that to me was, I guess, a way of compensating for feeling that even though we were felt being unequal, that was a way of compensating that. So not experiencing overtly racism, but also experiencing racism. That experience kind of got me prepared because for the first time, I was in the environment where the setting was mixed. There was people of color and there were people who were white. So it kind of helped me understand and to become accustomed to mingling, intermingling, what have you, with persons who were not Black. And it prepared me to be able to deal with and not be, because at one time didn't really know it, but I was afraid of white people because of the way I was prepared by my parents, that in a sense they didn't say I was not equal, but the presentation, as I look back, of them preparing me kind of made me feel unequal. So in my job experiences in New York, I went on to become a civil servant for the city of New York after applying and passing the civil service exam, and became well, they thought I was an expert in early childhood education because I had a graduate degree in early childhood, but I was more interested in administration. And that is one of the that is the job that led me to administration in a sense, because I had a caseload of daycare centers that were administered funds from and through the city of New York to community daycare boards. I don't want to get too much involved in that because it's kind of detailed. But these were the experiences that kind of got me into being comfortable in the presence of whites, uh, being able to communicate, and before I left, to supervise those persons who were uh, white. So there were not that many incidents that happened to me that were, and I guess I was fortunate, that were racially biased. Uh, but implicit in bias was the fact that I noticed there were no administrators at the top level who were Black. They were all white. My, of course, my immediate supervisor was Black, but that was on the local level. At the governmental level, which is what I'm referring to, there, when I first entered the job market as an employee for the city of New York, there were no Black administrators, supervisory administrators. Now, before I end, I was just reminded that the picture that you are reviewing from the slide is from when the group went to, I was still a student in grad school. We went to London, and we were able to have an experience at Cambridge, which is in London, with the Cambridge professors and so forth, and to experience witnessing how the classes were administered for the preschoolers in London. So that's just why I'm kind of deferring back to that picture. But getting back, and that was my experience during my years in grad school. That's one of the experiences, that is. But getting back to New York, all of the jobs that were equivalent to the one I eventually had were a mixture of Black and whites. But I think before I left New York, there was one Black administrator at the governmental level. And that was the only time I experienced that, Blacks being a part of the upper level of the government. Now, I did not experience a lot of I guess, negativism during my life in New York. And I guess I was fortunate because in my traveling back and forth, job-wise and so forth, I just happened to be in the company of those who were accepted. And I guess I was accepted because I was in their company in a lot of instances. So my experience throughout my years.
Why can't you hear it?
Beg your pardon? Oh, okay, that was something that was going on there. But this is kind of a, I guess, a picture of what happened to me while in New York. And um, this next to the last picture was the party, retirement party that was held when I retired from the city of New York back in 1995. Uh, and believe it or not, the person who is uh, facing me, even though she looks Caucasian, is black. And she resented being called white because she would always remind people that I'm black. Uh, and she was an interesting person because she said, when you retire, I'm retired. She was a supervisor, and at the time, I had become a supervisor, and we became very good friends. Her name was Joan, and this is just I just wanted to relay that the office that I worked from was diverse, and there were blacks and whites, and I, except for the parents that I worked with, counsel, and so forth during that time. Um, did not experience, I guess, the kind of bias that a lot of persons experience uh, during their adult lives. Uh, so that's kind of a remote picture of my life during the Jim Crow era. And now I'm back home in this picture, back in Elberton, Georgia, in which I guess people ask why and how I was able to return to Elberton and not be concerned about the conditions, because it was naturally, um, it was not separate anymore. But in my mind, it was not integrated the way the experience of integration was when I was in New York. So the way I dealt with that was because in my traveling back and forth from New York to Elberton, because my parents were still here and they eventually passed on naturally, I was able to deal with the situation as it was, and then was able to be appraised of the things that were going on in Elberton by my parents. So the transition from New York to Elberton was not as bad as one might think. So I just came back and became a citizen of Elberton, retired naturally, and after my parents and my mother was the last one to pass away, passed on, became involved in um, activities and cultural things in Alberton, and this is kind of how the Jim-Ree Museum emerged. We started out exhibiting at the Blackwell Cultural Center, which was the site of the old school that I had attended, during the Jim Crow era, and separate but supposedly equal days. And the exhibiting there during Black History Month, which eventually came into or emerged into what we call the museum after we acquired a site to do exhibiting at that site. So this is kind of, and I'm kind of abbreviating most of what went along because the time today. but this is kind of how I got involved in um, the Jim-Ree Museum. And it's kind of back and forth of how and what the Jim Crow era and the era as Negroes, which eventually we became uh, Black and uh, African Americans, as we all are now today. So this is just uh, I guess an eye view picture of my experience as one who lived from being born in Everton to living in New York and then returning back to Everton, and still now residing in Everton, happily married with my lovely wife here, Orla, and that is kind of it. I'm open to any questions that you may have. And thanks for the indulgence.